In many ways, my current project is a word study. I've been looking at the use of the adjective Christος in the feminine Christi in epitaphs across the classical and early Hellenistic Greek world. The adjective is variously translated, as I will shortly outline, but in 4th century BC Attica, its use in epitaphs is characterized as denoting the deceased as servile or at least of a humble status, and certainly never used of citizens. My research has seen me working to identify as far as I can all instances of Christos, Christi in the vocative in classical and early Hellenistic Attic epitaphs, considering on the basis of onomastic evidence and other markers how exclusively the epithet was used of slaves, and relatedly, if it was used more frequently or differently of men compared to women. I have then been contextualizing the Attic dimension by looking at the use of Christos, Christi elsewhere in the classical and Hellenistic Greek world, considering when and where, if anywhere, the epithet was used to indicate the servile status of the deceased, and if it was used more of or differently of men compared to women. In this talk, however, I will focus on the use of Christos and Christi in 4th and 3rd century BC Attica, and I will show that even in Attica, where there is a strong association between the adjective and slaves, that it was not used exclusively of slaves, and while I have not found it used of any deceased who can definitively be called a citizen, there are a few epitaphs that could conceivably have commemorated citizen women. So to give you an overview of this talk, while my research does look at the use of Christos and Christi across the Greek world, and I have looked at occurrences down to the late imperial period, this talk will focus on the adjective's use in 4th and 3rd century BC Attica. I'm going to start by giving the various translations of Christos and Christi and outlining the aims and outcomes of my PhD research to demonstrate how I became interested in the adjective and its use in the first place, and why the question of whether or not the adjective was used exclusively of slaves was important to my research. And I'll do this by using two stelae now in the Piraeus Museum as a case study. I'll move on to give an overview of the numbers of Attic epitaphs featuring Christos and Christi, and look at names accompanied by the adjective, and whether we are dealing with slave names. While most of these epitaphs are composed of just a name and the appropriate gender of the adjective, there are epitaphs bearing more information and even a few epigrams. I will talk through some of these examples in more detail, including nurses and Christi and epigrams. By way of conclusion, though this talk is Attic focused, I will mention a few instances of Christos and Christi elsewhere in the Greek world to contextualize my findings and show the scope of my research. So let's begin with the actual meanings of Christos. As I said, it is variously translated, but I would say the most common or standard translations are excellent, good, useful, and worthy. But I've also seen it translated as deserving, diligent, efficient, honest, loyal, reliable, serviceable, and valiant. Either way, the deceased is shown as praiseworthy, even if they were slaves. The translation useful perhaps best encapsulates the master-slave relationship if Christos is considered as primarily used to praise slaves. And we do need to think about master-slave relationships when we think about slave memorials, and whether all instances of epitaphs with Christos and Christi are slave memorials. We know from Demosthenes 43:58 that it was the duty of masters to bury their slaves. And when persons die in the demes and no one takes them up for burial, let the demarch give notice to the relatives to take them up and bury them, and to purify the deme on the day of which each of them dies. In the case of slaves, he shall give notice to their masters, and in the case of freedmen, to those possessing their property. And if the deceased had no property, the demarch shall give notice to the relatives of the deceased. Did the impetus to remember a slave as Christos or Christi come directly from the master then? And of course, discharge of proper burial did not need to include a stone marker, and certainly did not need a decorated one, as we shall see some tombstones bearing the epithet Christός or Christi were. Slaves in certain positions or roles, as I will show, may have been better placed to receive such a tombstone. Equally, as I've hinted, I don't think all epitaphs bearing the adjective Christός or Christe were erected to honour slaves, and similarly, not all slave epitaphs will be detectable on the basis of the presence of Christός or Christe. This brings me to my PhD research. My thesis covered non-citizen commemoration in 5th and 4th century BC Attica. Within this remit, I was primarily concerned with iconography and how non-citizens were represented or represented themselves in the spaces of the cemetery and sanctuary. Non-citizens here includes metics, so that's free resident foreigners, foreigners visiting or involved in diplomatic or trade relations with Athens, and finally, slaves. Commemoration includes decorated funerary monuments, votive reliefs, and decree reliefs. So in my current research, I've carried forward my interest in funerary monuments and slaves. While I was interested in iconography and the visual representation of these non-citizens, epigraphy played an important part in my methodology. How did I know that a funerary monument or a decree concerned a non-citizen? Well, it was attested in the epitaph or the decree. Ethnics attest with most certainty that the deceased dedicant or honorand was a non-citizen, a metic or a foreigner, but there are other indicators or likely indicators such as names, occupations, and references to dying away from one's homeland. In terms of iconography, what I was interested in was how non-citizen representation compared to citizen representation. Did it stand out from that broader corpus? And the answer for the most part is no. Iconographically, most memorials identifiable as those of non-citizens are not distinguishable from those of citizens. Indeed, anyone familiar with classical Attic tombstone iconography knows that we see the same motifs again and again. For example, the mistress and maid, of which I will be discussing 2 particular examples shortly, husband and wife, mother and child, the soldier, the athlete, the philosopher, so on. There are, however, a couple of motifs that appear more unique amongst metics and slaves, suggesting, as I have concluded in my PhD research, that there was at least some capacity for choice and differentiation in funerary monuments. So here we have some examples of those motifs. The 2 on the left give representation of the deceased's occupation. So we have Xanthipos now in the British Museum, who is considered to have been a metic, who holds up his cobbler's last, whilst Susinus of Gortyn has his bellows resting beside him. Other occupations seen depicted on the tombstones of metics include archer, aulos player, and possible butcher. The only occupation we see depicted on definitively citizen tombstones is priest. The 2 on the right are examples of the banquet scene on tombstones, a motif that, while common elsewhere, such as in the Greek East, is rare in 4th century BC Attica. And of those surviving examples where anything is said about the status of the deceased, they are non-citizens. So we're back to the point of the matter at hand here with Christe, because we have a useful nurse, and we also have an isotelis, so a privileged metic. We will come back to nurses as a particular group of Christe women later, but for now, an overview of sculpted tombstones where the deceased is referred to as Christός or Christe. In my thesis, I include 173 sculpted or decorated tombstones, which, based on supporting epigraphic evidence, or commemorated or likely commemorated either metics or slaves. Of these, 28 are included either on the basis of the presence of the adjective Christός or Christe, or the adjective is present with other markers of status such as an ethnic. Of these 28, 21 commemorate women and so use Christe, and only 7 use Christός or Christoi in the plural, the rare use of Crestoi on the stele of Dexippus and Dialos shown here. Most are of the Bildfeldstellen type, where the figural decoration is confined to a sunken panel, of which Dexippus and Dialos' stele shown here is an example. The Bildfeldstellen type is described by Karen Steers as, quote, the cheapest form of sculpted monument, unsurprising since the inscription of the term Khrestos implies that the monuments were brought and set up by the slaves' owners, who may well have kept expenses to a minimum, end quote. The question of the type and cost brings us back to master-slave relationships again, and who set up these apparent slave memorials and why. But then there is also the question of whether all tombstones bearing Khrestos or Kreste, whether of the Bildfeldstellen type or not, whether decorated or not, always commemorated slaves. And I want to look now at two stelae that I included in my thesis that I wonder whether or not should be included in a corpus of non-citizen sculpted tombstones, and use them as a jumping off point for going forward in talking about the use of Kreste in particular. So these two stelae are both now housed in the stores of the Piraeus Museum. And while one is of the Bildfeldstellen type just discussed, the other is a Nexkos stele. Both, however, feature scenes of the mistress and maid type so common in classical Attic funerary iconography. On both stelae, the seated woman is taken as the deceased, Plangon and Soteris respectively. Both are accompanied by a relative, Plangon likely by her husband and Soteris by a female relative, perhaps a daughter, and another figure whose position, stature and attire mark them out as servants. The sakos worn on the head and the box mark the girl behind Plangon, so that's the stele on the left, as a servant, while the long sleeve chitons, that's the dress, mark the figure on the stele of Soteris on the right as a servant. But yet the use of the adjective Kreste would have us think that both women commemorated by the stele were slaves themselves. So do we have here slaves with slaves? There is nothing else in their epitaphs to help us identify these women as slaves or not. Their names are not particularly indicative of servile status, as they are attested amongst slaves and citizens, but the same is true of many names attested with the adjective Khrestos or Kreste. While having included both stelae in my collection of non-citizen sculpted tombstones, I did so with the four following interpretations. Either these women were not slaves and Kreste cannot always be taken to denote slaves in Attic epitaphs. These women were slaves, hence the use of Kreste, but the idealizing nature of Attic funerary imagery means their memorials were not representative of their experience. The mistress and maid motif is well known in classical Attic funerary iconography, but whether the figure of the maid represented a real-life female slave or whether the family owned slaves at all is debatable. These women, or their relatives or master, knew full well these scenes were not a reflection of their experience, but wished to see themselves depicted this way anyway. And lastly, these women were slaves who had attained some sort of social mobility, and they wanted their memorials to reflect it. On a similar line, in a 1999 article on the reuse and reworking of stelae, Pologiori has suggested that the two women were freed women. For while the Nexkos stele was actually on its third phase of use by the time it came to be used for Soteris, Pologiori suggests that even in reuse it is difficult to imagine such a memorial being used for a slave. And while I think it is plausible that Soteris and Plangon were freed women, and this becomes more plausible when we look at more examples of the use of Kreste in 4th and 3rd century BC Attica, I am less convinced of Pologiori's interpretation of the iconography itself. She suggests that the scenes had a narrative character and that the standing servants represent Soteris and Plangon's time as slaves, while the seated women are them again, but as freed women upon their deaths. While there are funerary scenes which depict a specific event, usually the cause of death, such as in childbirth or in battle, I know of no other Attic funerary stele with such a narrative scene. Furthermore, as the mistress and maid scene is fairly common on classical Attic tombstones, would pairing the imagery with the epithet Christe be enough to trigger this alternative reading for the observer? While I would like to think that Soteris and Plangon had attained some sort of social mobility, perhaps as slaves living apart from their masters managing other slaves, or as freedmen with their own slaves, it is not possible to prove this either way, and the idealized repetitive nature of Attic iconography does not provide a solid foundation from which to build a picture of these women's lives and experiences. So on the basis of the epithet Christe, were Plangon and Soteris slaves, freedwomen, or never slaves at all? Does looking at the wider corpus of 4th and 3rd century BC Attic attestations of Christe help? So earlier, I said that there were 28 sculpted tombstones with Christos or Christe in the accompanying epitaph. That's 28 out of over 2,000 sculpted tombstones dating between the mid-5th century and the end of the 4th century BC. Even though the epithet Christi in the vocative is one of the most common epithets used in epitaphs across the Greek world, its occurrence in Attic epitaphs are fewer when we consider over 10,000 epitaphs survived from Attica from the Archaic down to the Imperial period. If we look at the table, the vocative Christi is never popular in Attica, despite being popular elsewhere in the Greek world from the 3rd/2nd century BC. Christos and Christi, however, are never more popular than in the 4th century BC at Attica. And while there are more instances of the use of the feminine Christe than the masculine Christos, when taking all instances of the adjective, the imbalance is less stark than just among sculpted memorials, with women praised as Christe much more likely to have received a decorated tombstone. In Attica then, Christos and Christe begin to be used from the early 4th century BC. Use dwindles in the 3rd century, probably not helped by a general decline in the numbers of stone funerary monuments, with a revival in the 2nd to 1st centuries BC. Elsewhere in the Greek world, Christos in the masculine is generally rare, but Christe in the feminine and the vocative don't really start to be used in any great quantity until the 3rd century BC at the earliest, and really not until the 1st and 2nd centuries BC in other places. Let's look in detail at those Attic epitaphs with Christos and Christe from the 4th and 3rd centuries of BC. The most common occurrence of Christos and Christe is with a single name and no other praise of or information about the deceased. 84 of the 121 epitaphs featuring Christos and Christe are just a name and the adjective. We can see, looking at the table, however, that there is more variation in epitaphs with Christi than Christos, more variation among women than men. So let's look at some of the names appearing with Christos and Christe. 122 individuals are praised as Christos or Christe in Attica in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. So that's 121 epitaphs, but we have Dexippus and Diaulus jointly praised as Christe in IG2 squared 11060, which we saw earlier. Granted, 121 epitaphs out of the total thousands that survive is not very many, but even so, there is little repetition among names of the praised individuals, whether we take them to be slaves or not. Among the 122 individuals, there are 102 different names, and these include foreign and ethnic names such as Manes and Syros, which are the two most common names attested for slaves, as well as names frequently attested among citizens such as Ariston, Aristion, and Stephanos. It cannot be assumed that those with foreign and ethnic names are slaves, while those with citizen attested names are not. Costas Vlasopoulos has shown that around half of the names of identifiable real slaves were attested among citizens as well as slaves. He suggests that either there were more Greek slaves, and he suggested reasons why this might be. He suggests that either there were more Greek slaves in Attica than is normally assumed, or that slave reproduction was more important in maintaining the slave population, and that such slaves were less likely to receive foreign or ethnic names, or that there was slave autonomy in choosing names rather than masters just assigning new names, or that having a citizen-attested name was a strategy among slaves and freedmen in order not to stand out as slaves or former slaves. So while we can say an individual with a name like Cyrus, who was praised as Christos, is pretty much definitely a slave, worthy Ariston and Stephanos with no patronymic or demotic are likely slaves as well. Going back to our slaves with slaves, Plangon and Soteris, the broader collection of names with Christos and Christe does not help us decide their status. As to individuals praised Christos or Christe with an ethnic, however, it's more open whether they were freeborn metics, freedmen or women, or slaves. There are 12 epitaphs containing Christos or Christe and an ethnic. You may note that this doesn't add up with the numbers of the second to last slide I showed you, as while the epithet Christos or Christe and an ethnic may appear in the same epitaph, they may not necessarily refer to the same person, though mostly they do, because mostly we're dealing with epitaphs where only one person is named. Looking at the ethnics though, we can see a mix of ethnics from Greece proper, such as Tygia in the Peloponnese, though I'll come back to that one, Epirus and Rhodes, and from the fringes of the Greek world, where slaves are thought known to have come from or been trafficked through, such as Thrace, Heraclea if we're dealing with Heraclea Pontica, and Maeotis in the Black Sea region. I said not all ethnics and adjectives describe the same person, and this is the case of Tibios, who was commemorated with a man from Rhodes and a woman who was possibly that man's wife. They're all commemorated together on that same stele. So who was Tibios to this man and woman? Was he their son or their slave? Were they all slaves with some connection to Rhodes, perhaps brought via Rhodes? We know that masters were responsible for burying their slaves and that slaves might be buried in the family plot, but what about on the same stele? And what about the rest of these men and women praised as Christos and Christi with ethnics? Are we to think of them as metics, freedmen and women, or slaves? Certainly they are not citizens, but this still opens up the scope of the use of the adjective. Often scholars who refer to the use of Christos in epitaphs at Athens talk about slaves and humble persons, but who does this encapsulate? Certainly there would have been poor metics, just as there would have been poor citizens, but there were also wealthy metics. One need only think of the Calathea monument in the Piraeus Museum for the father and son from Istros on the Black Sea, or examples of well-off metics known from the law court speeches. So I doubt it's as clear-cut as saying that the men and women here are some of the poorest metics with surviving tombstones, whilst all instances of epitaphs with ethnics but without Christos or Christe offer comparatively wealthier metics. We have a little more information about Sopatra from Macedonia. She was a nurse. While this perhaps makes her more likely to have been a slave than any of the other men or women here, she could still have been a freeborn or a freed metic. Aside from a wool plucker, nurse is the only occupation to appear with the epithet Christe in 4th century and 3rd century BC Attica. And I should stress that wool plucker is a man, so that's Christos. While we know from literary sources that not all nurses were slaves, it was a role better suited to slaves, with slaves from Thrace thought to make particularly good nurses, and a profession citizen women would only stoop to if they were in dire need. There are a total of 12 nurses described as Christe, 10 dating to the 4th century BC, 1 to around 300 BC, and 1, Sopatra from Macedonia, to the 3rd century BC. There are at least a further 9 epitaphs for nurses from the 4th century BC, and at least another 2 from the 3rd century BC. None of these nurses are praised as Christae, but 2 are remembered with their ethnics, Cythera and Corinth respectively. And so these nurses were perhaps metics rather than slaves. Aside from Sopatra, there are no other nurses praised as Christae with ethnics, but there is Melita, daughter of an Isotelis, a privileged metic, who we have to presume was free herself. Melita's epitaph is one of 6 examples of Christae used in an epigram, and so not directly comparable with other instances of Christae we have been looking at so far. It is also one of the 28 stelae where Christos or Christae appears in the epitaph and the stele itself is decorated. Here we see Melita, and the girl is presumably Hippostrate, her charge mentioned in the epigram. So Apollodorus, the Isotelis' daughter, Melita, nurse. Here the earth conceals the loyal nurse of Hippostrate. She now longs for you. While you lived, I loved you, nurse, and still now I honour you, even though you are under the earth. And I will honour you as long as I live. I know that for your part, even beneath the earth, there is a reward for the good, honours lie in store for you, first in the realm of Persephone and Pluto. Without the epigram, there is nothing in the scene to distinguish the relationship between the woman and girl as different from that of mother and child scenes, which we often see on Attic tombstones. Indeed, there is little to mark the decorated tombstones of nurses apart from other decorated tombstones that commemorated women at Attica. And here we have some examples. We see again the Bildfeldstellen type, that is the stele with the sunken panel, but we see nothing to mark these women particularly as nurses, except perhaps from Piraeus' stele, so that's second from the left, who has a pitcher by her feet, which Christopher Claremont has associated with the role of nurse and how much water and washing must have been involved in the role. Vessels are known from stele for other women, however, such as stelae where women are depicted spinning. We see again the banquet scene stele from earlier, the motif at Athens in the 4th century being associated with non-citizens, but in no way marking the deceased out as a nurse. I said earlier that epitaphs where the deceased is praised as Christos or Christae are few when we consider that thousands of epitaphs survive from Attica, and the decorated stele where the deceased is praised as Christos or Christae are even fewer. Of these, however, we've just seen some examples. Most decorated tombstones where the deceased is praised as Christae are for nurses. Of 19 tombstones for nurses from the 4th century BC, 11 are decorated, and I've shown you some of those. Melita, Pedusis, Piraeus, an unnamed nurse, and Pineti on the previous slide. We cannot know if all of these women were slaves, but it is likely that many were. Why were these women more likely to receive what must objectively, by virtue of being decorated, have been more costly and noticeable tombstones, even if we are talking about the cheaper Bildfeldstellen? Perhaps it was the very nature of their role, that they would be close to the family, particularly the children, and that such relationships were affectionate and maintained into adulthood. This is the impression we get from the epigram from Melita. We also have testimony of the affection charges felt for their nurses from the Demosthenic corpus. The plaintiff of Demosthenes 47 describes how he took in his old nurse. More than this, men of the jury, my wife happened to be lunching with the children in the courtyard, and with her an elderly woman who had been my nurse, a devoted and faithful soul, who had been set free by my father. After she had been given her freedom, she lived with her husband, but after his death, when she herself was an old woman and there was nobody to care for her, she came back to me. I could not suffer my old nurse or the slave who had attended me as a boy to live in want. The poor woman is subsequently killed trying to defend her former charge's property from men sent to carry off such property in lieu of a supposed outstanding charge. The passage is testament to the affection that could exist between masters and their slaves, or former masters and slaves, particularly one in such an intimate role and in a position of trust. The picture from Demosthenes is probably not even representative of the experience of all slave-let nurses, and certainly not of all slaves or former slaves. On the passage from Demosthenes, Mark Golden, in his contribution to the Cambridge World History of Slavery, points out, some might say cynically, all of this, of course, is meant to redound his credit with the jury. Golden points out elsewhere that nurses would have been a specialised kind of slave, not present in every household. Being cynical again, then, we might suggest that the reason nurses were overrepresented amongst women praised as Christi was almost a kind of conspicuous consumption. The master or family was showing that amongst their slaves they had had a nurse. This does not mean that such master-slave relationships could not have been affectionate, but it does get us thinking about the two sides of these relationships. Slaves in the role of nurse might be expected to be better treated, even freed, even looked after, even receive better honours upon their death. Masters may have wished to seem magnanimous and show that they had owned or been raised by a slave specifically used as a nurse. I come now to the last group of epitaphs featuring the adjective Christe that I want to discuss, and they are the epigrams. There are 6 epigrams featuring Christe, 5 dating to the 4th century and 1 to the 3rd. Of these, I've already mentioned 2, that of the nurse Melita, the daughter of the Aristotelis, and in the epigram for her son, Theotis, son of Teleson from Tiga in the Peloponnese, Nicorete, who is described as Christe, as an excellent woman. Melita was definitely not a slave, and Nicorete was probably a Metic wife, and so neither were citizens, but it shows a diversity in the legal status of the women the epithet applied to. Let's look at 3 other epigrams from the 4th century BC, for Xenoclea, for another Melita, and for Theophile. Worthy Xenoclea, leaving behind 2 young unmarried girls, Xenoclea, daughter of Nicarchus, lies here dead. She mourned the bitter death of her son Phoenix, who died out at sea when he was 8 years old. Who is so ignorant of grief, Xenoclea, that he does not pity your fate? Left behind you 2 young girls, and died of your grief for your son, who has a pitiless tomb lying in the dark sea. Melita. Greetings, grave of Melita. A good wife lies here. You are the best of all. You are the best of all, loving in return your loving husband, Onesimus, and therefore he misses you now that you are dead, for you were a good wife. Farewell to you, dearest of men, and love my children. And then lastly, Theophile, remembrance of your virtue, Theophile, will never pass away. So wise you were and faithful, and a worker possessed of all virtue. There is nothing in any of these epigrams to allow us to definitively call any of these women citizens, and yet the trope of the goodly and virtuous wife is perfectly appropriate for citizen wives and mothers. Perhaps they stood in periboiloi, where a name stele or the stele of others, and may have made their citizen status apparent. Could use of the feminine Christe then apply to citizen women? I should say I have found no examples of Christos praising potential Athenian citizen men. Can this be explained by thinking about the meaning of Christe as useful or goodly or excellent in relation to a master or perhaps husband, in a way that a husband would not comparably be called useful or goodly to a wife? While I think it's important that Christe in particular is problematized in this way, going back to Slaves with Slaves, Pangon and Soteris, looking at the wider use of Christe in 4th and 3rd century BC Attica, at the commemoration of nurses as a prized group of slaves, and now at Christe in epigram, all this does little to help us determine if these women were slaves, freed women, or, and perhaps this is a push, citizen wives. By way of conclusion then, there are a few instances of the use of Christos and Christe, and the vocative Christe, not common in Attica, that I want to look at outside of Attica, and this is not exhaustive at all. The epithet is used over much of the Greek world. With some cases, there's only a handful. Some were talking about dozens, others were talking about hundreds of epitaphs with it. Unlike in Attica, it doesn't really begin to be used until the 3rd century BC, and in other places still later. On Thassos and Rhodes, there are examples of Christос used to mark the deceased as servile, or at least as non-citizen. Elsewhere, such as in Boeotia, Christe seems to just be used as a general greeting and has nothing to do with the status of the deceased. And then differently again, to the north of the Black Sea, we see Christos and Christe appear as a personal name from the 1st century BC and continuing into the Roman period more so. So to leave you with my final thoughts, in 4th and 3rd century BC Attica, Christe, at least, does not always refer to slaves. This throws into doubt using the epithet to conclude whether the deceased was a slave, a freedman, or woman, e.g. The examples I gave you of Soteris and Plangon. Slaves in particular roles, such as nurses, were more likely to be honoured with a stone memorial and even a sculpted memorial. Attic use of Christos and Christe does not compare with its use elsewhere. I hope you found my talk interesting and the medium hasn't interfered with the message too much. Thank you.